The body arrived at the prison morgue on November 14, 1906. It had been a prisoner. Now it was evidence. The autopsy would be performed by the same physician who had administered the injection 13 days prior. He would measure the organs. He would note the necrosis. He would record the time of death with the same clinical precision he had used to record the time of inoculation. His name was Richard Pearson Strong. He was 33 years old. He was a graduate of Johns Hopkins University. He held the rank of major in the United States Army, and he had just killed 24 men. Not in battle, not in war. In a prison hospital ward in Manila, using syringes filled with what he would later describe as a tragic accident. The official investigation would conclude within months. The recommendations would be filed. The protocols would be revised. Strong would face a military tribunal, answer questions under oath, and return to his laboratory. He would go on to become one of the most celebrated tropical medicine researchers of his generation. He would lead expeditions to Peru and Liberia. He would advise governments and train physicians. He would die in his sleep in 1948, lauded and honored. But on that November morning in 1906, standing over the body of a man who had trusted him, Richard Strong faced a question that no amount of scientific acumen could answer. What happens when medicine becomes complicit in its own corruption? What happens when the healing profession decides that some lives are worth less than others? What happens when the laboratory and the prison become indistinguishable? The answer lay not in the morgue. It lay in the decisions made months earlier. It lay in the systems that brought Strong to Manila. It lay in the empire that built Bilibid Prison, and it lay in the belief, held by men who consider themselves enlightened, that science could justify almost anything. To understand how 24 prisoners died in a government hospital ward, we must first understand how they came to be prisoners at all. We must understand the war that preceded the experiment. We must understand the colony that housed the laboratory. And we must understand the medicine that made such experiment possible. The story begins not in 1906, it begins in 1898, when the United States won a war it barely understood and inherited, an empire it never intended to keep. It begins with the sound of gunfire in Manila Bay. It begins with the promise of liberation, and it ends with prisoners lying in their own waste, begging for water, as a Harvard-trained physician takes notes. This is the story of Bilibid Prison. This is the story of the cholera vaccine. This is the story of how empire, science, and expediency converged in a single moment of catastrophic misjudgment. And this is the story of what happened when nobody was held accountable. The Spanish-to-American War lasted 10 weeks. The Philippine-to-American War lasted 14 years. Most Americans could not have found the Philippines on a map in April of 1898 when Commodore George Dewey sailed into Manila Bay with orders to destroy the Spanish Pacific Fleet. The war had been declared over Cuba. The fighting in Asia was an afterthought, a strategic opportunity, a chance to establish American presence in the Pacific. Dewey's victory took 7 hours. The American fleet suffered 9 wounded and 0 deaths. The Spanish fleet was obliterated, and suddenly the United States found itself in possession of 7,000 islands, 11 million people, and no clear plan for what came next. President William McKinley would later describe his decision-making process regarding the Philippines in terms that revealed both his paternalism and his ambivalence. He claimed to have walked the floors of the White House night after night, praying for guidance. He claimed there was nothing left to do but take all the islands and educate the Filipinos and uplift them and civilize them and Christianize them as our fellow men for whom Christ also died. His reasoning overlooked the fact that the Philippines had been Catholic for 300 years. He overlooked the fact that Filipino revolutionaries had been fighting Spanish colonial rule since 1896. He overlooked the fact that those revolutionaries believed the Americans had come as liberators, not as replacement. Emilio Aguinaldo had declared Philippine independence on June 12, 1898. The Americans did not recognize the declaration. Instead, they negotiated the Treaty of Paris with Spain. Spain ceded the Philippines to the United States for $20 million. The Filipinos were not consulted. On February 4, 1899, fighting erupted between American soldiers and Filipino independence fighters on the outskirts of Manila. The war that followed would be brutal, decentralized, and largely invisible to the American public. It would involve concentration camps, scorched earth tactics, and the systematic destruction of rural communities suspected of harboring insurgents. It would involve the torture technique known as the water cure, in which prisoners were forced to swallow gallons of water until their stomachs distended, then beaten to expel the liquid. It would involve orders from American generals to kill every male over the age of 10 in certain provinces. It would result in the deaths of an estimated 200,000 to 1 million Filipino civilians, most from disease and starvation caused by the conflict. And it would create the legal and political architecture that made Bilibid Prison possible. Colonial governance requires infrastructure. It requires roads and telegraphs and currency and courts. It requires the ability to move people, process them, categorize them, and when necessary, confine them. The Spanish had built Bilibid in 1865. The name derived from the word alibid, meaning to encircle. In Tagalog, it stood in the Mahalig district, just outside the walls of Intramuros, the old walled city. It was designed to hold 400 prisoners. By the time the Americans captured Manila in 1898, it held over 1,500. The Americans kept it. They expanded it. They turned it into the central detention facility for the entire archipelago. By 1900, Bilibid housed not just criminals convicted of traditional crime, but insurgents, political prisoners, those detained under suspicion of aiding the resistance, and those caught violating the increasingly complex legal codes imposed by the occupying power. The prison became a laboratory in more ways than one. It was a site for testing theories of rehabilitation, hygiene, and racial classification. It was a site for observing disease patterns in a controlled population. And it was a site where the boundary between medical research and human experimentation began to blur. Because the Americans who came to govern the Philippines were not just soldiers and administrators, they were also physicians, and they came with a mission. The tropics were diseased. This was understood not as a political or economic reality, but as a biological fact. Yellow fever, malaria, dengue, cholera, typhoid, smallpox, beriberi, dysentery, plague. The Philippines were, in the language of the time, a pest hole, and American soldiers were dying. Not primarily from combat, from disease. During the first 2 years of the Philippine-American War, for every soldier killed in action, 5 died of illness. The military needed solutions. It needed research. It needed data, and it needed test subjects. Enter the Bureau of Science. Established in 1905, the Bureau of Science was tasked with studying the natural resources, public health challenges, and disease ecology of the Philippines. It operated under the civilian colonial government, but maintained close ties with the military. Its laboratories were staffed by American physicians, many of them recent graduates of Johns Hopkins, Harvard, and Pennsylvania. These were men trained in the new scientific medicine. They believed in germ theory, experimental method, and statistical analysis. They believed that disease could be understood, controlled, and eventually eradicated through rigorous application of scientific principles, and they believed that the colonial context offered unique research opportunities unavailable in the United States. Richard Pearson Strong was one of these men. Born in 1872 in Fortress Monroe, Virginia, Strong had grown up in a military family. His father was an artillery officer. Discipline, hierarchy, and duty were foundational values. He attended Yale, then Johns Hopkins Medical School, where he studied under William Henry Welch, one of the founding figures of American pathology. He completed additional training in tropical medicine in Germany and England. By 1903, at the age of 31, he had been appointed director of the biological laboratory of the Bureau of Science in Manila. His research focused primarily on tropical diseases prevalent in the Philippines. He studied plague, he studied beriberi, he studied dysentery, and he studied cholera. Cholera was a particular problem. The disease had swept through Manila repeatedly during the Spanish colonial period. It returned in epidemic waves, killing thousands. The Spanish infrastructure had been inadequate to control it. The Americans were determined to do better. Cholera is caused by the bacterium Vibrio cholerae, transmitted through contaminated water. It causes extreme diarrhea and vomiting. Untreated, it can kill within hours through dehydration. There was no cure, but there was the possibility of prevention. European researchers, particularly Wilhelm Colli and Richard Pfeiffer in Germany, had been experimenting with cholera vaccines since the 1890s. These vaccines were made from killed cholera bacteria. The idea was to stimulate the immune system without causing the disease itself. The results were mixed. Some studies showed reduced mortality in vaccinated populations. Others showed no effect. The vaccines were painful. They caused fever, swelling, and severe local reactions. And they had never been systematically tested. In a controlled human trial, Strong wanted to change that. He wanted to determine once and for all whether the cholera vaccine worked. He He wanted to establish proper dosages, he wanted to refine the preparation methods, and he wanted test subjects who could be monitored continuously, whose movements could be controlled, whose compliance could be guaranteed. He wanted prisoners. This was not unusual. The use of prisoners in medical research was, at the turn of the 20th century, considered acceptable under certain conditions. Those conditions were poorly defined. There were no institutional review boards. There were no informed consent documents. There were no ethical guidelines established by law. The Declaration of Helsinki would not be written until 1964. The Nuremberg Code would not exist until 1947. In 1906, the prevailing assumption among researchers was that prisoners could be used for experiments provided the risk was not excessive and provided some benefit might accrue either to the prisoner or to society. The definition of excessive risk was left to the researcher. The nature of benefit was unspecified, and the question of consent was largely ignored. Strong approached the administration of Bilibid Prison in October of 1906. He requested permission to conduct cholera vaccine trials on the prison population. The request was granted. No formal protocol was submitted. No oversight committee reviewed the proposal. No prisoners were consulted. Strong selected 24 men. They were not volunteers in any meaningful sense. They were told the vaccine would protect them against cholera. They were told it was safe. They were told the American government wanted to help them. Whether they believed any of this is unknown. Whether they felt they had a choice is unknown. What is known is that on the morning of November 1st, 1906, 24 prisoners were escorted to the hospital ward of Bilibid Prison, where Richard Strong waited with syringes prepared. The vaccine had been prepared in Strong's laboratory. It consisted of heat-killed cholera bacteria suspended in saline solution. The standard dose was 2 cubic centimeters, administered subcutaneously. Strong had prepared the doses himself. He had labeled the vials himself. He had checked the contents himself, or so he believed. The injections began at 10 in the morning. The prisoners were called forward one at a time. They rolled up their sleeves. Strong administered the injection. They returned to their beds. The entire process took less than an hour. By noon, the first prisoner began to complain of nausea. By 2 in the afternoon, several were vomiting. By evening, all 24 were experiencing severe gastrointestinal distress. This was not normal. The cholera vaccine was known to cause localized pain and mild fever. It did not cause systemic illness. It did not cause vomiting. It did not cause the profound weakness and abdominal cramping now overtaking the ward. Strong examined the patients. He noted the symptoms. He reviewed the dose. He checked the labels on the vials. And then, slowly, a terrible possibility began to form in his mind. He returned to his laboratory. He examined the remaining vaccine stock. He tested the contents. And he discovered that the vials he had used that morning did not contain cholera vaccine. They contained live plague bacilli, plague, not cholera, plague, Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the Black Death, the disease that had killed 1/3 of Europe in the 14th century, the disease that still appeared in sporadic outbreaks across Asia, the disease that was, in its septicemic and pneumonic forms, almost universally fatal. Strong had injected 24 men with live plague. How this happened would become the subject of the investigation. Strong's laboratory maintained stocks of multiple pathogens for research purposes: cholera, plague, dysentery, typhoid. The vials were stored in the same refrigeration unit. They were labeled, but the labels were handwritten, and the handwriting was evidently similar enough to be confused. Strong would later testify that he had personally prepared the cholera vaccine. He would testify that he had personally labeled the vials. He would testify that he had personally selected the vials used for the injections. But he would also acknowledge that he had not personally verified the contents through microscopic examination on the morning of the injection. He had trusted the labels, he had trusted his own system, and his system had failed. The prisoners began to die on November 3rd. 2 men succumbed within 48 hours of injection. Their symptoms progressed rapidly: fever, chills, swelling of the lymph nodes, delirium shock. Strong administered experimental plague serum obtained from the Pasteur Institute. It had little effect. He administered supportive care, fluids, morphine for pain, cold compresses for fever. It was insufficient. By November 7th, 13 men were dead. By November 14th, the death toll had reached 24. Every single man who received the injection died. The mortality rate was 100%. This was not a vaccine trial. This was a mass poisoning, and the question that would haunt the investigation was not whether Strong had made a mistake. That much was obvious. The question was whether the mistake constituted criminal negligence. The Army convened a board of inquiry on November 21, 1906. The board consisted of 3 officers, none of them physicians. They interviewed Strong. They interviewed the prison administrators. They examined the laboratory records. They reviewed the autopsy reports, and they issued their findings in January of 1907. The board concluded that the deaths resulted from an accident. They concluded that Strong had acted without malicious intent. They concluded that the confusion of vials, while tragic, did not constitute gross negligence. They recommended improvement to laboratory labeling procedures. They recommended additional oversight of human experimentation, but they did not recommend criminal charges. Strong was reprimanded. He was temporarily reassigned, and within a year he was back in his laboratory conducting research. The families of the dead prisoners received no compensation. No public apology was issued. No memorial was erected. The incident was recorded in military medical journals as a cautionary tale about laboratory safety, not as an ethical catastrophe, and Strong's career continued. But why? Why was an incident that killed 24 men treated as a procedural failure rather than a mortal one? To answer that question, we must understand who the prisoners were. We must understand how they were seen. And we must understand the assumptions that made their deaths grievable in theory, but forgettable in practice. The 24 men who died were not Americans. They were Filipinos, they were prisoners, and in the calculus of colonial medicine, their lives occupied a category distinct from those of white American citizens. This was not articulated explicitly in the official reports. It did not need to be. It was embedded in the structure of the research itself. The experiment was designed to protect American soldiers from cholera. The risk was borne by Filipino prisoners. The benefit, if any, would accrue to the occupying power. This asymmetry was considered natural. It was considered justified. It was considered progress, because the alternative, in the minds of men like Strong, was to allow disease to continue unchecked, killing soldiers and civilians alike. Better to test the vaccine on prisoners than on the general population. Better to take a calculated risk than to do nothing. And if the risk turned out to be catastrophic, well, that was the price of scientific advancement. These were not the thoughts of a sadist. They were the thoughts of a man who believed deeply in the value of his work, who saw himself as a servant of public health, and who could not or would not recognize that his good intentions did not absolve him of responsibility for the consequences. Strong would go on to publish extensively on plague. He would develop improved diagnostic techniques. He would contribute to the understanding of plague transmission. And he would never, in any of his subsequent writings, express remorse for the deaths at Bilibid. He would describe the incident as unfortunate. He would describe it as a lesson learned. But he would not describe it as a crime. The prisoners had no names in the official reports. They were listed as Subject 1 through Subject 24. Their ages were recorded. Their medical histories were summarized, but their names were omitted. This was standard practice in medical research of the period. Subjects were anonymous. Data was universal. The individual was subsumed into the aggregate, but this anonymity was not neutral. It was a form of erasure. It allowed the researchers to maintain emotional distance. It allowed the investigators to focus on procedural failures rather than human loss. And it allowed the American public, to the extent they learned of the incident at all, to view it as an abstraction rather than a tragedy. Who were these men? The records tell us very little. Most were incarcerated for minor offenses: theft, vagrancy, violations of curfew or permit regulations. Some were political prisoners, detained for suspected sympathies with the independence movement. None were serving sentences for violent crimes. They ranged in age from 19 to 47. They spoke Tagalog, some Spanish, very little English. They had families. They had lives before Bilibid, but those lives were not considered relevant to the inquiry. What mattered was the procedural question. What mattered was whether protocols had been followed. What mattered was whether American military medicine could be improved. The prisoners themselves mattered only as data points in that larger equation. This was not unusual. This was the logic of colonial science. Research conducted in the colonies operated under different ethical assumptions than research conducted in the metropole. Distance, both geographic and conceptual, made certain kinds of experiments possible. Experiments that would have been unthinkable in Boston or Philadelphia were routine in Manila. Not because the researchers were uniquely cruel, but because the structures of empire created a moral distance that made cruelty seem reasonable. The same government that would never have authorized the injection of live plague bacteria into America. Prisoners saw no insurmountable obstacle to doing so in the Philippines. The same medical establishment that would have demanded rigorous oversight for experiments on white subjects accepted vague assurances when the subjects were colonized people. And the same legal system that would have prosecuted a physician for malpractice in the United States declined to do so when the victim were prisoners in a territory whose political status remained ambiguous. The Philippines were not a state. They were non-independent. They were an unincorporated territory subject to American authority but not entitled to the full protections of American law. This liminal status extended to the prisoners. They were under American jurisdiction but not American citizens. They could be detained, tried, and punished under American law, but they could not claim the rights that American law theoretically guaranteed. This ambiguity was not accidental. It was the result of a Supreme Court decision rendered in 1901 in the case of Downs v. Bidwell. The case concerned tariffs on goods imported from Puerto Rico, another territory acquired in the Spanish-American War, but its implications extended far beyond trade policy. The court ruled that the Constitution did not automatically apply in full to territories acquired by the United States. Instead, Congress had the authority to determine which constitutional protections would be extended and which would not. This doctrine became known as the Insular Cases. It created a legal framework in which American power could be exercised without American accountability. It meant that people living under American rule could be denied rights that would be guaranteed to anyone living within the 50 states. And it meant that atrocities committed in the territories could be adjudicated under a different standard than atrocity committed at home. The prisoners at Bilibid fell into this legal gray zone. They were subject to American authority, but they were not protected by American constitutional guarantee. Their deaths could be investigated, but they could not be prosecuted as violations of their civil rights, because, in the eyes of the law, they had no such rights to violate. This was the legal architecture that made the Bilibid experiment possible. Not just the accident, the entire structure of using prisoners as experimental subjects without informed consent, without independent oversight, and without meaningful accountability. Strong's mistake was the immediate cause of death, but the system that placed him in that prison, with those prisoners, with that authority, was the deeper cause, and that system would remain intact long after the bodies were buried. The news of the death reached the United States in late November of 1906. It was reported in a handful of newspapers, primarily those with a focus on military affairs or colonial policy. The coverage was brief. Most articles ran fewer than 300 words. The tone was regretful but not outraged. The deaths were described as the result of an unfortunate error, a confusion of vials, a tragic accident in the pursuit of scientific progress. There was no sustained public outcry. There were no congressional hearings. There were no demands for accountability. Why? Part of the answer lies in the nature of American media coverage of the Philippines. By 1906, the war was officially over. The United States had declared the insurgency defeated in 1902. The sporadic fighting continued for years afterward. The American public had moved on. The Philippines were no longer front-page news. They were an administrative problem, a distant responsibility, a topic for specialists and bureaucrats. The deaths of 24 Filipino prisoners in a medical experiment did not register as a national scandal. It registered as a minor mishap in a faraway place, and in the hierarchy of newsworthiness, it could not compete with domestic political scandals, labor unrest, or the burgeoning progressive reform movements. Another part of the answer lies in the racial attitudes of the period. Early 20th century was the height of scientific racism in the United States. Eugenics was taught at major universities. Racial hierarchies were codified in law. The notion that white Americans had a duty to civilize non-white populations was widely accepted, not just among imperialists, but among progressives who saw colonialism as a form of uplift. In this context, the deaths of Filipino prisoners were easily rationalized. They were unfortunate, they were regrettable, but they were also, in a sense, expected. The tropics were dangerous, disease was rampant, research required risks. And if those risks fell disproportionately on colonized population, well, that was simply the reality of doing science in difficult conditions. These attitudes were not confined to the general public. They were reflected in the medical literature. Articles published in the Journal of the American Medical Association and other leading publications discussed the Bilibid incident in terms of laboratory procedure, not ethics. The focus was on how to prevent similar accidents in the future. Better labeling, better verification, better record keeping. The question of whether prisoners should be used as experimental subjects at all was rarely raised. The question of whether consent was necessary was dismissed as impractical. The question of whether the deaths constituted a violation of medical ethics was not seriously entertained, because the ethics of the time did not yet recognize prisoners, particularly colonized prisoners, as possessing full moral standing. They were research subjects. They were objects of study. They were means to an end, and the end, the advancement of medical knowledge, the protection of American soldiers, the improvement of public health, was considered sufficiently important to justify almost any means. This was not the reasoning of monsters. This was the reasoning of ordinary professionals operating within a system that normalized exploitation, and that, perhaps, is the most disturbing aspect of the Bilibid case. It was not an aberration. It was not the act of a rogue researcher operating outside acceptable norms. It was the predictable outcome of a medical research culture that had not yet developed the ethical frameworks necessary to constrain its own ambitions. Strong was not alone in using prisoners for research. Other American researchers in the Philippines conducted similar experiments. Bailey Ashford studied hookworm by infecting prisoners, then treating them to observe the progression of the disease. Victor Heiser conducted beriberi research using prison populations. Edward Vedder tested experimental treatments for tropical diseases on inmates. These experiments were not hidden. They were published. They were celebrated. They were seen as evidence of American scientific prowess and colonial benevolence. The fact that the subjects had not consented, that they bore all the risk while others reaped the benefit, that they were drawn from a population with no political power and no legal recourse, was not considered problematic. It was considered efficient. This was the context in which the Bilibid deaths were assessed, not as a moral catastrophe, as a technical failure. And once the technical failure was addressed, once the labeling procedures were improved, the system could continue as before, which it did. Strong returned to his research. The Bureau of Science continued its work. Bilibid Prison continued to house political prisoners, common criminals, and anyone else the colonial government deemed necessary to confine, and the deaths of November 1906 became a footnote, a cautionary tale in medical textbooks, a minor incident in the larger history of American colonialism, until someone asked the question that the official investigation never seriously considered: what did the prisoners think was happening to them? We will never know with certainty. The historical record is silent on their subjective experience. No interviews were conducted, no statements were recorded. They left no letters, no diaries, no memoirs. But we can infer certain things from the context. We know they were prisoners. We know they lived under conditions of coercion. We know they had no meaningful ability to refuse when American doctors told them to roll up their sleeves. And we know that within hours of receiving the injections they understood something was terribly wrong. The symptoms of plague are unmistakable: sudden fever, agonizing swelling of the lymph nodes, particularly in the groin, armpits, and neck. These swellings, called buboes, give bubonic plague its name. They are excruciatingly painful. The skin over the buboes turns black as tissue does, and septicemic plague, the form most likely to result from direct injection into the bloodstream. The infection spreads rapidly. Blood pressure drops. Organs begin to fail. The extremities turn black from gangrene. Delirium sets in, and then death. The prisoners would have known they were dying. They would have known the American doctor had done this to them, and they would have known there was nothing they could do about it. Did they believe it was intentional? Did they believe the Americans had poisoned them deliberately? Or did they accept the explanation that it was an accident, a terrible mistake? We cannot know, but we can consider what it meant to be a Filipino prison in Bilibid in 1906. The prison was a site of colonial violence. Torture was not uncommon: the water cure, beating, prolonged solitary confinement. These were tools of interrogation and control. Some of the prisoners in Bilibid had been detained without trial. Some had been arrested for political activity. Some had watched their villages burned by American soldiers. They had no reason to trust their captors, and when those captors appeared with syringes, speaking a language most prisoners did not understand, offering assurances filtered through interpreters, the dynamic was not one of medical care. It was one of power. The prisoner could comply, or they could face consequences. The nature of those consequences was unspoken but understood. This was not consent. This was coercion, and the distinction mattered. It mattered legally, though the law of the time did not recognize it. It mattered ethically, though the ethics of the time did not enforce it. And it mattered humanly, in ways that the official investigation systematically ignored, because to acknowledge that the prisoners had been coerced would have required acknowledging that the entire research program was built on exploitation. It would have required acknowledging that American medical science in the Philippines operated according to different rules than American medical science at home. It would have required acknowledging that the colonial project, for all its rhetoric of uplift and progress, was willing to sacrifice colonized lives in the name of protecting American ones. And that acknowledgement would have undermined the moral legitimacy of the entire enterprise. It was not made. Instead, the investigation focused on procedure. It focused on labels and verification and chain of custody. It treated the deaths as the result of human error, not structural violence. And it allowed everyone involved to continue believing that they were, despite the tragedy, engaged in necessary and noble work. Strong certainly believed this. In his testimony before the Board of Inquiry, he expressed regret for the deaths. But he also defended the necessity of the research. He argued that cholera was a serious threat. He argued that vaccine development required human trials. He argued that prisoners were an appropriate population for such trials because they could be carefully monitored. He did not argue that prisoners had a right to refuse. He did not argue that the risk should have been disclosed more fully. He did not argue that the power imbalance between American researchers and Filipino inmates created an inherently coercive situation. These arguments were not available to him, not because he was incapable of making them, but because they were outside the conceptual framework of colonial medicine. Within that framework, the use of prisoners for research was not a problem to be solved. It was a resource to be managed. And the deaths at Bilibid were not a reason to stop. They were a reason to be more careful. This distinction is crucial. It explains why Strong faced no criminal charges. It explains why the medical establishment rallied to his defense. It explains why his career not only survived but flourished. And it explains why the same patterns of exploitation would continue for decades. Because the problem was not Richard Strong. The problem was a system that made Richard Strong's possible, a system that valued scientific progress over human dignity, a system that treated colonized populations as laboratories, a system that allowed researchers to operate with minimal oversight, minimal accountability, and maximal impunity. And that system did not end with the Bilibid case. It evolved, it became more sophisticated, it developed protocols and guidelines, but it retained its fundamental logic. The logic that some lives are worth more than others. The logic that risk can be offloaded onto the powerless. The logic that good intentions excuse bad outcomes. This logic would shape medical research for the next half-century. It would shape the Tuskegee syphilis study, in which black men were denied treatment for syphilis so researchers could observe the natural progression of the disease. It would shape the Guatemala syphilis experiments, in which American researchers deliberately infected Guatemalan prisoners, soldiers, and psychiatric patients with sexually transmitted diseases. It would shape radiation experiments conducted on prisoners, disabled children, and pregnant women without their knowledge or consent. All of these atrocities occurred within living memory. All of them were conducted by credentialed professionals. All of them were justified, at the time, as necessary for scientific advancement. And all of them traced their lineage back to the assumption that made Bilibid possible, the assumption that researchers know best, the assumption that the ends justify the means. The assumption that the vulnerable can be sacrificed for the greater good. These assumptions did not die with the adoption of the Nuremberg Code or the Declaration of Helsinki. They persisted. They adapted. They found new contexts in which to operate. But their roots lay in the colonial laboratories of the early 20th century. In places like Bilibid, in experiments like Strong's, in deaths that were documented, investigated, and ultimately forgotten. The bodies of the 24 prisoners were buried in a common grave. No markers were erected. No ceremonies were held. The prison kept records of the death, but those records listed only the date, the cause, and the disposition of remains. The family were notified. Some received the bodies for private burial. Others could not afford to retrieve them. Those bodies remained in the prison cemetery, in unmarked plots, indistinguishable from the dozens of other prisoners who died of disease, violence, or neglect during their incarceration. Within a year, the incident had faded from official memory. The Bureau of Science issued new guidelines for laboratory safety. Vials containing different pathogens were to be stored in separate refrigeration units. Labels were to be color-coded. A second researcher was to verify the contents of all materials used in human experiments. These were reasonable precautions. They might have prevented another accident like the one that killed the Bilibid prisoners, but they did nothing to address the deeper ethical problems. They did nothing to establish informed consent requirements. They did nothing to create independent oversight. They did nothing to ensure that prisoners had the right to refuse participation in research, because those problems were not, in the eyes of the colonial administration, problem at all. They were simply the conditions under which research was conducted. And research had to continue, because disease had to be conquered, because American soldiers had to be protected, because the Philippines had to be civilized, and because science by definition was progress. This was the narrative that allowed the Bilibid deaths to be absorbed and forgotten, not denied, not hidden, just rendered unremarkable, just one more cost of empire, one more sacrifice on the altar of advancement, one more tragedy that could be explained away as the price of doing business in the tropics. And so the work continued. Strong continued his research on tropical diseases. In 1913, he led an expedition to Peru to study Oroya fever and Verruga peruana. In 1926, he led an expedition to Liberia under the auspices of the Harvard University Africa expedition. He published over 200 scientific papers. He trained a generation of tropical medicine specialists. He served as a consultant to the League of Nations Health Organization. He received honors from universities and governments. He was elected to the National Academy of Sciences, and he never publicly acknowledged that the deaths at Bilibid represented anything more than an unfortunate accident. In his memoir, published posthumously, he devoted a single paragraph to the incident. He described it as a tragic mistake. He noted the improvements to laboratory procedure that resulted, and he moved on. No reflection on the ethics of using prisoners. No consideration of the power dynamic, no acknowledgement that the men who died were anything more than unfortunate casualties of scientific progress. This silence was not unique to Strong. It was characteristic of the entire generation of colonial researchers. They saw themselves as heroes. They saw themselves as bringing the benefits of modern science to backward regions. They saw themselves as saving lives, and they could not, or would not, see that they were also taking lives, that they were perpetuating systems of exploitation, that they were complicit in the violence of empire. This blindness was not total. There were critics. There were voices, even at the time, who questioned the ethics of colonial research. Filipino physicians and intellectuals protested the use of their countrymen as experimental subjects. Anti-imperialist activists in the United States highlighted cases like Bilibid as evidence of colonial brutality, but these voices were marginal or were dismissed as politically motivated. They were accused of standing in the way of progress, and they were drowned out by the louder chorus of those who believed that American science was a civilizing force. That chorus included most of the American medical establishment. It included university administrators who welcomed the funding and prestige that came from tropical research. It included military officials who valued the knowledge gained from experiments on colonized populations. It included politicians who saw scientific achievement as proof of American superiority. And it included much of the American public, to the extent they thought about the issue at all, because the deaths at Bilibid did not fit the story Americans wanted to tell about themselves. The story they told was one of liberation, of bringing democracy and progress to the benighted Philippines, of fighting disease and ignorance, of building schools and roads and hospitals. The deaths at Bilibid complicated that story. They suggested that American benevolence had limits. They suggested that American science was not always ethical. They suggested that the colonial project was built on violence and exploitation, not just good intentions. And so the deaths were forgotten, not actively suppressed, just allowed to fade, just pushed to the margins of historical memory, until they became a footnote, an anecdote, a minor incident in the grand narrative of American tropical medicine. But for the families of the dead, the deaths were not minor, they were not footnotes, they were loss that could not be explained or justified or rationalized away. They were fathers and brothers and sons who went to prison and never came home, who died in agony in a government hospital at the hands of men who claimed to be helping them, and who received no justice, no compensation, no acknowledgement, just silence. The same silence that has surrounded so many colonial atrocities, the silence that allows perpetrators to die honored, the silence that allows system of exploitation to persist, the silence that allows us to believe that such things could never happen today, but they do. They happen in different forms, they happen under different names, but the logic remains the same. The logic that treats some lives as expendable, The logic that prioritizes the needs of the powerful over the rights of the vulnerable. The logic that allows us to look away when the victims are far away, or poor, or imprisoned, or otherwise marked as less than fully human. This is the legacy of Bilibid, not just the specific deaths of 24 men in 1906, but the structure, thought that made those deaths possible. The structure that persists whenever we allow medical research to proceed without informed consent. Whenever we allow pharmaceutical companies to conduct trials in countries with weak regulatory oversight. Whenever we allow prisons to be used as laboratories. Whenever we allow the pursuit of knowledge to override the obligation to do no harm. The Nuremberg Code, written in response to the horrific medical experiments conducted by Nazi doctors, established principles that seem obvious in hindsight. Voluntary consent is essential. The experiment must be designed to yield important results. The risks must not exceed the humanitarian importance of the problem. Subjects must be free to withdraw at any time. Researcher must be prepared to terminate the experiment if continuation is likely to result in injury or death. These principles were written in 1947, 41 years after Bilibid. If they had been in force in 1906, the deaths would not have occurred. Strong would not have been permitted to inject prisoners without their informed consent. He would not have been permitted to proceed without independent oversight. He would not have been permitted to continue the experiment once it became clear that the subjects were experiencing severe adverse reactions. But those principles did not exist, and so the experiment proceeded, and the men died, and the system that killed them continued for decades, until the weight of accumulated atrocities finally forced a reckoning. The Tuskegee study was exposed in 1972. The Guatemala experiments were revealed in 2010. The radiation experiments came to light in the 1990s. Each revelation prompted outrage, each prompted reforms, each prompted promises that such things would never happen again. But the reforms were always reactive. They addressed the specific abuses that had been exposed. They did not address the underlying structures. They did not address the power imbalances. They did not address the willingness of researchers to exploit the vulnerable in the name of progress. And so the abuses continued. They continue today, in different forms, in different contexts, but with the same logic, the same calculus that some lives are worth less than others, the same assumption that the ends justify the means, the same silence that descends when the victims are people we find easy to ignore. This is why the Bilibid case matters, not because it was uniquely horrific, but because it was typical, because it reveals the banality of exploitation, because it shows how ordinary people operating within ordinary systems can commit extraordinary harm, and because it reminds us that the distance between civilization and barbarism is not as great as we would like to believe. Strong was not a sadist. He was not a Nazi doctor gleefully torturing victims. He was a respected researcher. He was a graduate of elite institutions. He was a man who believed he was doing good, and yet he killed 24 men, not through malice, through carelessness, through arrogance, through a failure to see the people he was experimenting on as full human. And that failure was not his alone. It was systemic, it was cultural, it was the product of an empire that treated colonized people as resources. It was the product of a medical profession that had not yet developed ethical constraints. It was the product of a society that valued progress over justice. And it was the product of a silence that allowed all of this to continue, the silence that descended after the deaths, the silence that greeted the investigation, the silence that accompanied Strong's rehabilitation, the silence that allowed the story to be forgotten. That silence is the final crime, because it is the silence that permits repetition. It is the silence that allows new generations of researchers to repeat the mistakes of the past. It is the silence that allows us to believe we have learned the lessons of history when we have only filed them away. The prisoners of Bilibid have no monument. They have no museum. They have no place in the official histories of American medicine or American colonialism. They are absent from the biographies of Richard Strong. They are absent from the institutional histories of Johns Hopkins and Harvard. They are absent from the commemoration of American achievements in tropical medicine. They are absent because their presence will complicate the narrative. It would force us to acknowledge that progress has a cost. It would force us to acknowledge that the cost is not evenly distributed. It would force us to acknowledge that we have benefited from research conducted on people who had no choice and no voice, and that acknowledgement is uncomfortable. It is easier to forget. It is easier to focus on the advance. It is easier to celebrate the cures and the vaccines and the knowledge gained. It is easy to tell ourselves that such things could never happen now. But they do. They are happening. They will continue to happen. Until we confront the systems that make them possible. Until we confront the assumptions that make them acceptable. Until we confront the silence that make them forgettable. The body arrived at the morgue on November 14th, 1906. It was the last of 24. Richard Strong performed the autopsy. He noted the necrosis. He measured the organs. He recorded the findings. And then he closed the file. The investigation would continue for a few more weeks. The board would issue its report. The recommendations would be filed. And the machinery of colonial medicine would continue its work. Because there was always more work to be done. More diseases to study. More vaccines to test. More knowledge to acquire. And there were always more subjects. More prisoners. More colonized people. More lives that could be risked in the name of progress. The system did not need Richard Strong to be a monster. It only needed him to be a professional. It only needed him to believe that his work was important. It only needed him to trust that the people in charge had made the right decisions about who mattered and who did not. And he did. He believed. He trusted, and 24 men died. Their names deserve to be remembered, but they are lost. Their stories deserve to be told, but they are gone. All that remains is the record of their deaths. The record that shows they were subjects, not patients, objects, not people, data points in an experiment that failed, and the record of what happened afterward. The record that shows the system closed ranks. The record that shows the perpetrator was protected. The record that shows justice was never served. This is the lesson of Bilibid. Not that accidents happen. Not that research is risky, but that systems of power protect themselves. They protect the powerful. They sacrifice the vulnerable, and they do so while claiming to act in the name of the greater good. This was true in 1906. It remains true today. The names of the institutions have changed. The language has evolved. The oversight has improved, but the fundamental dynamic persists. Medical research still requires test subjects. Those subjects are still disproportionately drawn from vulnerable populations, prisoners, poor people, people in countries with weak regulatory systems. And when something goes wrong, the response is still the same. Investigate the procedure, improve the protocols, protect the researchers, and move on. The victims are mourned, perhaps, but they are not centered. They are not prioritized. They are not given the power to hold the system accountable. Because if there were, the system would have to change. It would have to acknowledge that consent is not a formality. It would have to acknowledge that power imbalances invalidate consent. It would have to acknowledge that some research should not be done, regardless of the knowledge it might generate. And that acknowledgement would threaten the entire enterprise. It would threaten the universities that profit from research. It would threaten the pharmaceutical companies that rely on human trials. It would threaten the governments that use medical research to advance geopolitical interests. It would threaten all of us who benefit from medical advances without asking too closely how they were achieved. And so the acknowledgement is not made. The questions are not asked. The system continues. And the victims remain nameless, buried in unmarked graves, forgotten by history, remembered only as numbered, subject 1 through subject 24. Men who died so that others might live, except that is not quite true, because the cholera vaccine Strong was testing was never proven effective. Subsequent trials showed mixed results. The vaccine was never widely adopted. The knowledge gained from the Bilibid experiment was minimal. The deaths were not just unjust. They were also unnecessary. The prisoners died for nothing, or rather, they died for a principle. The principle that research must continue. The principle that setbacks are acceptable. The principle that progress requires sacrifice. And the principle that some people are more suitable for sacrifice than others. This is the calculus of empire. This is the calculus of colonialism. This is the calculus that allowed 24 men to be injected with plague and die screaming in a prison hospital while the world looked away. And this is the calculus we must reject. Not just in retrospect. Not just when the victims are safely distant in time and space, but here, now, in the research being conducted today, in the clinic trials being run in developing countries, in the experiments being performed on prisoners, in the studies that proceed without meaningful consent. We must ask who benefits. We must ask who bears the risk. We must ask whether the research is truly necessary. And we must ask whether we would accept the same risks if the subjects were our own families. If the answer is no, then we must not allow the research to proceed, not because it might fail, not as it might cause harm, but because it is built on the same logic that killed the prisoner at Bilibid, the logic that some lives matter less, the logic that progress justifies exploitation, the logic that silence is acceptable. That logic must be named. It must be challenged. It must be dismantled. Or it will continue to produce victims. New victims. In new contexts, with new justifications, but the same underlying crime, the crime of treating people as means rather than ends, the crime of valuing knowledge over dignity, the crime of looking away when looking closely would require us to change. The body arrived at the morgue on November 14, 1906. Richard Strong examined it. He took notes. He closed the file, and he went back to work, because there was always more work to be done. But the body remained. It remained in the grave. It remained in the record. It remained as evidence of what happens when medicine abandons ethics, when empire erases humanity, when progress demands sacrifice, and when the powerful decide who must be sacrificed. 24 men died at Bilibid, not because they were sick, not because they were criminals, not because they were unlucky. They died because they were powerless. They died because they were colonized. They died because they were prisoners. And they died because the system that claimed to protect them decided they were expendable. That is the truth of Bilibid. Not a tragic accident, a structural inevitability, the predictable outcome of a system designed to exploit. And the system did not die with them. It survived. It adapted. It persists. In the laboratories, in the prisons, in the colonial relationships rebranded as development, in the research partnerships that extract data from poor countries, in the clinical trials that would never be approved at home, in the consent forms signed by people who have no real choice, in the deaths that are documented, investigated, and forgotten. The system persists, and so the question remains: what will we do about it? Will we continue to look away? Will we continue to justify exploitation in the name of progress? Will we continue to allow the vulnerable to bear the costs while the powerful reap the benefits? Or will we finally acknowledge that some things are more important than progress? That human dignity cannot be sacrificed on the altar of knowledge? That consent is not a technicality but a moral imperative? That justice delayed is justice denied? And the silence surrounding Bilibid is not just a historical problem but a contemporary crime? The prisoners cannot answer these questions. They are dead. They have been dead for over a century, but their deaths pose the questions nonetheless. And we are responsible for the answers, not the researchers of 1906, not the colonial administrators, not the military officials who authorized the experiment. U.S. We who inherit the knowledge gained through exploitation. We who benefit from medical advances achieved at the cost of lives we never knew. We who have the power to change the system and choose not to. The responsibility is ours, and the silence is ours to break. So let us say their names, except we cannot, because the names were never recorded. The men were never seen as worth remembering, and that erasure is the final violence, the violence that denies the dead even the dignity of being mourned. The violence that allows us to speak of the incident without speaking of the individuals, the violence that turns people into case studies, lies into data, deaths into footnotes. That violence did not end in 1906. It continues every time we tell the story of medical progress without telling the story of its cost. It continues every time we celebrate researchers without asking what they did to achieve the results. It continues every time we benefit from knowledge without asking how it was obtained. And it continues every time we remain silent when we should speak. The prisoners of Bilibid cannot speak, but we can. We can tell their story. We can name the injustice. We can demand accountability. And we can refuse to allow their deaths to be forgotten, not as a tragic accident, but as a crime enabled by empire, justified by racism, perpetrated by professionals, and covered up by silence. That silence ends here, with the acknowledgement that what happened at Bilibid was not an aberration, it was the system working as designed, and with the commitment to dismantle that system, to build something different, something that values all lives equally. Something that recognizes consent as non-negotiable, something that holds researchers accountable, something that refuses to sacrifice the vulnerable for the benefit of the powerful, something that remembers. The body arrived at the morgue on November 14, 1906. It was examined, documented, and buried, but it was not forgotten, not entirely, not as long as we continue to ask how it came to be there, not as long as we continue to demand answers. not as long as we refuse to accept that progress requires victims. The prisoners of Bilibid were victims. They did not volunteer, they did not consent, they did not benefit, they were used, and they were discarded, and the men who used them faced no consequences. That is the truth, that is the crime, and that is the legacy we must confront. Not to assign blame to long-dead individuals, but to understand the systems that enabled them, systems that persist, systems we participate in, systems we must change, or the deaths will continue, in different forms, under different names, but with the same logic, the logic that treats people as means, the logic that values knowledge over dignity, the logic that allows the powerful to decide who is expendable. That logic must end, here, now, with us, or the bodies will continue to arrive at the morgue, and the files will continue to be closed. And the work will continue, and the victims will continue to be forgotten, until we decide that enough is enough. Until we decide that no amount of progress is worth a single life sacrificed without consent. Until we decide that the vulnerable deserve protection, not exploitation. Until we decide that silence is complicity. And until we decide that the dead deserve more than footnotes, they deserve justice. They deserve remembrance. They deserve our refusal to allow their deaths to be in vain. 24 men died at Bilibid in November of 1906. Their names are lost, but their deaths remain, as evidence, as warning, as demand. The demand that we do better, that we be better, that we build a world where such deaths are impossible, not because researchers are more careful, but because the systems that enable exploitation have been dismantled. That is the work, that is the responsibility, that is the only fitting memorial to the men who died. Not a monument, not a plaque, but a world transformed. A world where consent is sacred, where power is checked, where the vulnerable are protected, where research serves humanity, not empire, where progress does not require victims, and where silence is no longer acceptable. That world does not yet exist, but it must, for the 24, for all those who came after, and for all those who will come. If we do not act, the body arrived at the morgue on November 14, 1906. It has been there ever since, waiting for justice, for acknowledgement, for us to say, this should never have happened, and this will never happen again. Not on our watch, not in our name, not ever. That is the promise we must make, to the dead, to the living, to ourselves, and that is the promise we must keep.